So before I start, I would like to read you guys a story by Andrew. Back in the day, I owned a severely troubled automobile. It was my first car, which was the turd, for more reasons than one. That car was the bane of my existence. Not only because it was old, rickety, and an eyesore, but because it just did not seem to want to run, no matter how much money I dumped into it. For an entire year, I was in and out of different auto shops, moving from mechanic to mechanic, trying to find one who could successfully repair that thing. And each successive repair would only keep the car functional for a maximum of 2 months. I began to conclude that mechanics were worthless because they couldn't seem to do their jobs correctly. They could not fix my broken machine. Finally, I decided that enough was enough. I concluded that the only answer was to boycott the whole system. That was when I decided, without any knowledge of auto repair, that the only person that was going to fix my car was yours truly. If you ever have met me, you know this was perhaps the most galactically stupid idea ever made. Me fixing cars is like Keanu Reeves trying to do serious theater. My first repair endeavor was a front brake job. I repaired the bearings and replaced the brake pads. I thought I had done a pretty decent job too, so I did not bother to give a test drive after the repair. The following morning, as I left for school, I didn't give my brakes a second thought. I drove down my street at about 40 miles per hour, approaching the same spotlight I passed through every morning. Then I began to apply pressure to the brake pedal. But as I did, something terrifying and unbelievable happened. First, the brakes began to howl my name like an unholy banshee. Andrew! And the second, the vehicle slowed, but not by much. And third, the steering wheel yanked the truck severely to the right. And then I let out a yell like a terrified cheerleader in horror films, and the truck was airborne. It jumped the curb, the sidewalk, and the grass on the other side. My sins, my mistakes, and all the people I had befriended and or disappointed in my lifetime blipped in front of my vision. I was about to die, he thought. Then the truck came crashing to the ground in a ditch. Sound returned to my world with fury upon impact. My chest ricketed off the steering wheel, and water exploded all around me like a geyser. I opened the door and stepped from the ride gingerly, shocked, and I was uninjured, and my head was still attached to my neck. I was left wondering, how in the world was I going to get my truck out and running again? So we've been going through the book of Jonah, so let's recap. So God sent Jonah to Nineveh, and he went the other way to Tarshish, and then there was this huge storm, and he was thrown overboard, and there's the big fish who saved him, and he was there for 3 days and 3 nights, and then the big fish spit him out again, and there he was, in Nineveh. But then Jonah has a close relationship with God. He knew who God was. He knew that the God he was serving was a God of mercy, and of compassion, and of grace, and that he wouldn't destroy Nineveh. So Jonah was super duper upset. In Jonah 4 verse 5, it says, "Then Jonah went out to the east side of the city and made a shelter to sit under as he waited to see what would happen to the city. And the Lord God arranged for a leafy plant to grow there, and soon it spread its broad leaves over Jonah's head, shading him from the sun. This eased his discomfort, and Jonah was very, very grateful for the plant." And on verse 7 it says, "But God also arranged for a worm. So the next morning at dawn, the worm ate through the stem of the plant so that it withered away. And as the sun grew hot, God arranged for a scorching east wind to blow on Jonah. And the sun beat down on his head until he grew very, very faint, and he wished to die. He said, 'Death is certainly better than living like this,' he exclaimed." Man, wasn't Jonah bitter? He's this grumpy dude story with a car, well, there are many of us who could parallel with Andrew's story and this true life parable. Not in automobile matters, but in spiritual ones. Where a lot of times we're so exhausted from disappointments with other Christians. Tired of being let down, we have decided to go it alone and try to mend our own wounds on our own. And our reasons for taking flight to our own private islands are justified, or so we think. Our pastors committed adultery, or a brother or sister gossiped about us in church, and a mentor got a divorce, or a Christian celebrity that we adored came out from the closet, and a friend deserted us in time of need. There's a lot of reasons why we could be disappointed with other Christians. And instead of us continuing to put ourselves out there to be disappointed again, we decide that our Sundays are better off spent sleeping in. That's not worth it to go to church, we think. But soon, many of us find ourselves with a frustrated, if not bitter attitude, just like how Jonah was with the people of Nineveh. Having lost faith in God's vessel, we begin to question him. And it's hard to imagine finding a way back to healing, health, and reattachment to not only the body of Christ, but to God himself. How can we do it with all that has happened? I would like to submit to you that the way home is actually much simpler than you can ever imagine. And even if you don't have the desire to return to fellowship at this point, what I'm about to say may cast new light on past wounds. I'm going to suggest a simple yet drastic decision to see life in a different way. I'm going to ask you for just a moment to put a new pair of glasses. And they are the lenses of grace. So let's get back to our passage. On verse 9, it says, "Then God said to Jonah, 'It is right for you to be angry because, is it right for you to be angry because the plant died?' And Jonah said, 'Yes, even angry enough to die.' Then the Lord said, 'You feel sorry about the plant, though you did nothing to put it there. It came quickly and died quickly. But Nineveh has more than 120,000 people living in spiritual darkness, not to mention all the animals. Shouldn't I feel sorry for such a great city?'" Wow, God's mercy is beyond our comprehension. First, let's ask ourselves a question. Why do the faults of other people affect us so severely? And the answer to that is another question. Is it not because we are looking to those very people for something that only God can provide? It's so easy for us to forget that God, is the only being that can make us whole. Just like in the beginning of the story, Jonah, he forgets how big his God is. He thought, I'll just run away. And I don't want for the people of Nineveh to get safe, so I could just solve my problem that way. But God is bigger than everything. He knows what Jonah was going to do, and he knows that he has all these weights with a big fish that's going to eat him. So what was Jonah thinking? He can't run away from God. And so likewise, it's very easy for us to allow people to take God's place. Why? Because we see and touch people. They're tangible. But once we begin looking to other humans to meet our needs for security, peace, wholeness, and repair, we will inevitably be let down. Broken people cannot mend broken people. Knowing this is the first step to having grace for others. So, armed with this knowledge, we can then change our expectations. It is at that point that we can also change how we react when people disappoint us. Once this happens, we will feel so personally affected by the shortcomings of other believers and forgiving them when they fall is so much easier. Soon we'll feel much differently about inviting others to our island again. But there's more. Grace for other humans is the key to healing for our wounds. It realigns our priorities and puts people back in the proper place in our hearts. When we realize that humans are not our providers, healers, or redeemers, then we are freed from much of our pain. The sting of the hurt is disarmed. And this is why grace for others is so important. It exists not only for the one who is receiving, but for the one who's giving. Accept that humans are just humans. Accept that the church is flawed, and resist the urge to ever place people in a higher regard than they deserve. In this, you will find empathy for the mistakes of others. Others who are trying to find their way in this fallen world just like you. So, what about those who has hurt us so bad, who's wounded us so deeply that grace seems just, impossible? Well, Jesus said, forgive your brother 70 times 7 times, for that is how many times your Father in heaven forgives you. It's not an excuse for the stupidity or selfishness of others. It does not absolve them from consequence. You're not letting them off the hook, because that fishing line doesn't even belong to you. It belongs to God. Releasing someone from your frustration doesn't mean that they will not face repercussions, especially before God. Rest assured, these things have a way of coming back around in the end. You can feel good about having grace for others without feeling like a doormat. In fact, the very act of having grace is empowering and not weak. Once you open the door to this idea, you realize that life is so much lighter when you're not clinging to all the wounds with a death grip. So let's get back to Andrew's story. What happened to him after? He says, after the great crash of '92, I realized that the mechanics weren't the problem. The problem was that I was asking them to do the impossible, to fix a car that was beyond human repair. Finally, I stopped blaming the mechanics, and I stopped playing the mechanic myself. I accepted the fact that it was no one's fault that my car was a piece of crap, except that it maybe, just maybe, it was time for me to change my viewpoint. And then I was free to let that car go, along with all the problems that came with it, including my darkened outlook. I left all of it in a junkyard where it belonged. So what are you going to do today? Will you play God in your life, or would you surrender everything to God and just rest in His grace and His mercy?